reinstalled the camshaft position sensor housing and the sensor itself and the bolt that holds it in place. Now my next thing I'm going to do is put the exhaust manifold back on. It's going to connect here, and it's going to go down there and connect down to the exhaust pipe down there. It's also going to, it has a bracket that's going to connect up right over here on this post. It's on the motor mount as well. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Throw your gasket on, put the thing on there, tighten it down, torque these down to 37 feet per pound, I believe is the torque on these. So simple enough. Get those on, torque them down. Hook it up down there and put the cover back on. Make sure to hook up the oxygen sensor as well. I'm going to go pretty quick on that. Now that we've gotten the exhaust manifold back on, I went ahead and I just popped this bar back in. It's not connected yet. I just popped it back in just to get it out of my way. I'm going to go ahead and put the intake manifold back on. I've installed the gasket here, you can see. So I'm going to go ahead and put this intake manifold on. After I get it in place, before I put on any nuts and bolts on, I'm going to make sure that this bracket gets put on it looks like it goes on these last two bolts that are going to go in that bottom hole down there, and this hole here are going to go through these holes here on the outside of their intake manifold. Once I get all that together, I'm going to tighten down those bolts to a specified 19 feet per pound torque, and then we'll move to hooking up all the hoses. Alright, at this point I've pretty much put the rest of the engine all back together. I've finished hooking up all the hoses and all the sensors that we disconnected from the intake manifold. I installed the air intake cover again, rehooked up the sensors for that. I've installed the fuel rail as well as the fuel injectors here, the fuel injector control system I've rehooked up. Also the ground that we mentioned before has been reinstalled right there. The grounds have been reinstalled up here on this bolt here for back there. There are some rings that you have to get and replace. Whenever you pull these fuel injectors out, there's some rings, they're fairly cheap, that you need to replace in here. So I went ahead and picked up some of those and put them in there, just little donut rings. They just go right in there and keep your fuel injector from wiggling around. I've reattached the bypass hoses on this side. I've left the hose off right here because I still need to put the timing chains in, and that's going to be the next part. That's a crucial part, and I'm going to film this in some detail, but after that, you know, the rest of putting it back together is pretty straightforward. Just reversing what we've done before. You know, starting with putting the cover on, then working your way back up with the bracket for the air conditioning unit, then installing the air conditioning unit, putting the pulleys back on for the water pump, the idler sprocket, the tensioner, getting the belt back on, and sticking the radiator back in, filling the fluids up and getting going. So that's pretty much the rest of it after that. So I'm going to focus on the timing chain system now, because that's very important. One thing to keep in mind here is I do have the knock marks lined up. If I get down here a little lower, this knock mark is lined up there, this knock mark is lined up there. I can't put them anywhere other than pretty much at 4 spots. So this one's the one that's lining up there. Down here I do have this mark lined up with, let's see, move that, this mark here, so we know we're still at top dead center. I did put the pistons visually at top dead center before I put the head on, and we have not rotated the crankshaft at all. So we took apart the pieces for the timing chain and the tensioners. It released the springs, and so these tensioners popped out. So I did take this tensioner and was able to push it back in. I'm going to show you a little trick here. There's a latch right there. You want to push this latch, this little release latch, down as far as you can, downward, compressing the spring, and while you're squeezing this piston in. Once you get that all the way down, wedge something underneath it so it locks it in place, like I did here with a paper clip. The other chain tensioner You can just squeeze in by hand, really easy. There's no ratcheting involved. And then I just stuffed another paper clip in there to hold it in place, as you can see. First we're going to put on the idler sprocket. Real simple. Just goes right there. Alright, so the idler sprocket's in place. Notice that there's a mark on the idler sprocket right here. And there's also one almost 180 degrees on the idler sprocket right here. It should be slightly off to the right if the one on the idler sprocket at the top is pointing straight up. And that's where you want it, straight up. Kind of lining up with here. There's the mark. The other one is just to the right of being in the center down here. So this is the lower chain, or the big chain. There's a lower or big chain and an upper or smaller chain. And you want to put the lower chain on first. When they come, there are colored links on them. On this particular one, they're black. There's one there and one there. And those links are used to line up with marks, such as the one on the idler sprocket or on the crankshaft gear. So I know that it needs to line up with this mark on the crankshaft gear. I'm just going to cheat and put that on there right now and line that up so I can see that I have that mark lined up with that link. Then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to install it on the crankshaft. And I need to keep some tension on it so that it doesn't slip off. I also know that the other black mark, black link, is supposed to line up with a certain tooth on this idler sprocket. And so while keeping tension on the chain so it doesn't slip off the bottom, I'm going to slip this link onto the idler sprocket to match up with that mark. Alright, one thing I didn't mention is that you actually have to have the colored links facing the engine, which makes it a little more difficult. So I can see that I have the colored link back here facing the engine lined up with my mark here. It's hard to tell the bottom one, so you might want to invest in a mirror. I was able to take this mirror and I'm able to look down there. You probably can't see it here, but I can see my colored link is lined up with my mark, which is right at the bottom there. So it took me a little figuring around, but I've got my black link marked up there, lined up with this mark. This is off center, this mark here, so I know that my mark up here is the correct one and not that one. All my slack is on the left side, not on the right side, and by using a mirror I know that my black link is lined up down here with my mark. I'm actually going to insert that little key that holds that sprocket on down there so that we don't have to worry about losing that. And then I'm going to insert, you can see I can push this and it takes all the tension up on there. So I'm going to insert the chain tensioner here. I'm going to bolt it back in right there and there. Once that's in place, I will go ahead and pull this paper clip to release the spring. Alright, I've actually already installed the top timing chain here. It was kind of a difficult thing really to film and install at the same time. But notice on the upper timing chain, first of all, the colored links, the black ones on this one, sometimes they're going to be blue, sometimes yellow. You're going to have them facing forward this time, not towards the engine block like we did on the lower timing chain. They are lined up with their spots, with their dots, their marks on the different sprockets. That's the black one here. But notice that I have this slack right here, and I don't want that, and I don't have much slack here. I'm going to put the tensioner here. Well, I'll put the tensioner in place, and then before I release it, I'm going to take my wrench here that I have on the cast nut of the cam itself, and I'm going to rotate a little bit. As I do, it'll take that tension or that slack out of the top, and it'll put the slack down there at the bottom, and then I'll release that tensioner and it'll hold that slack down there. I'm not rotating it that much. This isn't causing a problem, and this is something that you have to do sometimes when you put it first back together, especially after it's been machined and in the shop. Here's my tensioner here I'm about to install. You can see this goes on there, and then the two bolts with the gasket will go right over in here. I've installed the tensioner here, released the tensioner on here. Most of the tension is now and the slack is taken up here. I am also still going to, my last step here is I need to tighten up these bolts. So remember, hold on to the nut in the camshaft there, and then you'll be able to turn the bolt without the whole camshaft turning on you. Alright, after everything's tightened up, all these bolts are in and everything's tight, put your crankshaft pulley bolt back in your crankshaft here, screw it all the way in, and take your wrench and give this 2 complete revolutions with your wrench, and make sure you don't feel any resistance from hitting a valve somewhere in here. After 2 revolutions, stop, and your marks of your pulleys of your gears should still be all lined up after 2 complete revolutions. We're top dead center here. These here are also lined up, top dead center. Alright, everything is good to go. I've rotated it. I rotated it 10 times. Everything still lines up perfect. Okay, the last thing here is I have applied RTV sealant to the edges of my timing chain cover. I'm going to put that on now. I did have to loosen this back up. I shouldn't have put this on yet. I think I can loosen it up to like about there and be able to still get the cover on. I'm going to go ahead and put that cover on and tighten up the bolts. And then from there I'm going to go ahead and put the air conditioning unit bracket back on and the air conditioning unit back onto there. And then apply the water pump pulley, the crankshaft pulley, the idler, and the tensioner pulley. Alright, I've gone ahead and installed the camshaft cover now. It's already in. I've also installed, well, it's kind of hard to see here. I've installed all the pulleys and the belts down there. Got those all in. So the next thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and put my spark plugs in. I've got all 4 new spark plugs ready to go. I'll put those in. I will go ahead and put the ignition coils in on top of the spark plugs and connect those bolts that hold those down. Then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to start working on putting the radiator in. So I'm going to put the radiator shroud in first, and then I will attach the fan blade, and then I will slide the radiator in and attach the transmission cooling lines down there at the bottom, and attach the radiator hoses. And we're almost done. Alright, I've gone ahead and I've put the spark plugs in and I put the ignition coils in. They're all attached. I went ahead and finished off attaching any hoses. And I've been making a careful look around to see if there's anything I've missed, any hoses or any connections. I do see I need to put the throttle cable back over here in the clip. And kind of just going over everything. I put the fan shroud in. The next thing I'm going to do is bring the radiator over. I'm going to attach the fan first, and then I'll drop the radiator in. And here we are. Everything is all put back together. Radiator's in, everything else is in. Next step, let's put some fluid in, put some oil in, and start her up. One last thing is we don't want to forget to plug this relay back in underneath the dashboard. So I'm going to plug that in before I try starting it up. And it's working. A little bit of steam coming off it. I've got a little bit of a water leak I can see back in the back there that I'm going to have to fix with this tube connect. I need the new O-ring. I tried to use the old O-ring, it didn't work. But that's it. We've replaced the head and the head gasket, the timing chain, and everything's going great.